The year I turned 14 was the last year I would be permitted to attend my favorite summer sleepaway camp, St. George's. The camp is located in Orkney Springs, Virginia, a sleepy little unincorporated community entirely centralized around the existence of the Orkney Springs Hotel. Built in the early 19th century, then restored in the 70s after ownership changed, there is to this day a stagnant quality of time in Orkney Springs which contributed greatly to the mood of the camp. Everything was a frozen effect. Antique relics from the hotel's early history on display behind velvet ropes. Old southern recipes from the same line of Moo-Maa woman pumping hearty fare out of the communal kitchen. And the same rusty, dangerous elevator which campers were chastised to never play on leading up to the kitchen. The camp is also owned by the Episcopal Diocese, and so subsequently we shared the timeless sights, sounds, and smells of that place, forever caught in a long-ago decade. Being 15 is a fussy age, a little too old to enjoy macaroni art or tie-dye t-shirts or sing-alongs without that first hint of the self-conscious discomfort that comes with puberty. At 14, I was still content with these things, though they admittedly were already beginning to lose a little of their succor. As a camp senior, the option was given to me to pick one of the 3-day wilderness excursions: canoeing, hiking, or rock climbing. I chose canoeing, and then with 10 other campers and 3 counselors, we departed in a van with our boats for what I assume now was the South Branch of the Potomac River. We would be crossing over into West Virginia at some point, though that was often the case. The joke goes at St. George's that you can pick blueberries until Virginia and take a PUMS Virginia all in the same 5 minutes. The first day out, we passed boats with rural hunters as our canoes dragged lazily through a reedy dip in the river. They were the kind of West Virginian hunters you see in horror films, with 3 teeth, overalls over bare skin, and big old bloodhounds piled in a wet next to them in their busted canoes. They cracked piss beer out of styrofoam coolers and spoke in a dialect so thickly garbled that I doubt even the counselors knew what they were saying. I remember one counselor holding a map out to the boat ahead of us, attempting to ask questions. The second day back out on the water under the burning hot sun, the counselors told us we were lost. Naturally, we were upset, but they reassured us that as long as we were following the river, eventually we would come out on the other end, nearing something familiar. Looking back now as an adult, I realized how young these counselors must have actually been, and I still wonder if their training was even adequate. The youngest might have been 17, the oldest in his early 20s, but I was 14 then, so I didn't want to think about any of those things. With little choice other than just to agree and keep rowing, we kept going forward. That afternoon, we pulled up on an unknown pebbly bank in order to make camp. A recent flood had torn debris from the river and washed it up on shores, as far up and down as the eye could see. All along the edge of the clearing, we found were natural teepee formations made of mangled tree trunks and wild, snarling branches. We dragged our canoes up the rocks to tuck them in beside the trees, and remember waves of tiny frogs fleeing in front of us in a green tide, and one fat toad that flopped on my boot toe wouldn't leave. Later, while hunting a suitable girl's latrine spot, I went inside one of the natural teepees and discovered the bloody skeletons of poached raccoons hanging wetly above. The blood hadn't completely dried yet. Their tails were still intact, fluffy in the breeze. A snuffed-out fire pit was directly below, and I thought the men with 3 teeth in their dogs were probably the ones likely to have done this. That night, we ate and sang camp songs and had s'mores, and looked at the stars. After dark, for a briefly frightening time, a certain moaning noise began to intermittently come out of the woods. Our counselors quickly rushed to reassure us that the sounds were from cows, and that we must have camped at the very edge of a farmer's grazing property. We quickly accepted this and went to bed. The girls went to their tarp in one corner, Yards away, the counselor slept in their tent, and the boys' tarp sat on the farther side of our grounds. I woke up deep in the middle of the night, with a mighty need to pee. I climbed out of the pile of snoring teenage girls, grabbed a flashlight and a bathroom kit, and ambled out into the trees to find a perfect spot. I don't remember being afraid in that particular moment, mostly interested in satisfying my bladder by emptying it. It was calm enough that when I encountered a strange figure a few minutes into my walk, I stopped, assuming it was one of my fellow campers. About 10 feet away from me, sitting on a broad, flat rock, was a young boy. He looked about my age, 14, maybe a week 16. His head was buzzed and his hair looked pale, maybe blonde. It was cold outside in a way that only mountains can be at night, and yet he wasn't wearing a shirt. He was a little cave-chested, and he sat with one elbow propped up on his knee, barefoot in tattered, ash-washed jeans. He was smiling just a little and looking directly at me. My first inclination was anger. I thought at first that this was Alex, one of the boys camping with us who worked picking corn with his father. I was about to tell him off for being a creep and watching girls pee in the dark, when I realized that there were a few fundamental things about what I was looking at that were wrong. This was not Alex. This was not Alex. This definitely was not Alex. The boy's eyes flickered in the beam from my flashlight, like a deer or a cat does when they cross headlight beams on the road. There was a gold fluorescence to it that human eyes couldn't produce. I remember standing there for some time, just staring at him, as my mind was trying to put this puzzle together. The length of time I stood there staring is the single detail I can attribute to knowing that this really happened to me, that it was real, when years later all I can think about is that science must have an answer to this somewhere. The universe is so huge that we know so little about it, but that I know that I saw this. Because I looked at him, and he looked back at me, so directly, so incredibly aware of me and I, of him, until I realized I could see the trees behind him through his body. I could see through him, that she was smiling at me, and we were lost. There's a quality of fear when it becomes that incredibly intense which makes you entirely lose your grasp of time. All I know is that I dropped everything in my hands, my toilet paper, my flashlight, and I ran through the dark. Before I knew it, I was lost in the woods. I have no concept of how long I ran alone through the dark. I have never been this scared in my life, and I pray that I never will be again. Everything gets distorted. Time, breath, space, thought. I don't remember screaming either, but apparently I was. A scream's loud enough that a friend woke up and came to find me, popping up unexpectedly from behind a bush and scaring the shit out of me all over again. The one miracle I can attest to is I never actually pissed my pants, though I think it would have been justified. Back at the camp, I tried to wake up the girls. I cried and begged for them to listen to me, that I thought I seen a ghost and we need to get out of here. But no one really cared. I tried to lay back down and go back to sleep, but I kept hearing footsteps circling around us just behind the tree line. A constant crunch, crunch, crunch of 2 bare feet in the underbrush. The next morning when I retold my story to anyone who would listen, a few shy girls told me that they had heard the footsteps in the woods. When the sun was at its morning's brightest, after wrestling with myself about it, I finally returned to the rock that I found the boy sitting on. I stood on it and looked around at the ground. The dirt was scattered with rusting shotgun shells. That day, we got back in our boats and followed the river back to the familiar territory. I don't have any recollection of where this site was, or if I could indeed ever find it again, though I know I would never want to.
My story takes place out in the woods of Oregon. My first name is Greg and I love all things natural. I didn't do much camping or exploring the woods when I was younger. No. My love for camping started at around 19, when I went on my first camping trip. The funny thing about it is that I'm originally from Portland, Oregon. Yes, I'm a city boy, as most country people call it. You wouldn't know this now, as I live on a more rural area and I go camping all the time. As I spoke earlier of my first camping trip, you should know that's what this story is about. My first time camping was wondrous, strange, and somewhat an eerie experience. It being my first time, I went with my buddy who I will call Donnie. This obviously isn't his real name, but while I don't mind my identity being someone out there, I'll keep his anonymous for privacy and safety reasons. Anyway, we went camping and, full disclosure, we did smoke some good weed. My buddy and I, high out of our minds, thought it'd be a good idea to leave our campsite and just wander off into the woods. You gotta understand, we were tripping hard. Donnie kept telling me about this woman he was hearing singing in the woods. I laughed and told him he was toasted, but I followed him anyway, partly out of want for his safety and partly out of curiosity. We wandered for a few hours, oblivious to how deep we were really going, all in search of this elusive and beautiful voice Donnie swore he had heard. Now, I'm not sure if it was the influence of the weed we were smoking, this is a very real possibility, or if I really heard voices, but after a time, I began to actually hear this woman he claimed was singing. Even stranger, I heard multiple women's voices. I am fairly certain, but still not entirely certain, that everything we heard and the things we saw were because of the drugs. You will understand what I mean shortly. So anyway, we are following the voices until we hit a spot where I'm 99.9% sure I can see a group of women dancing without clothing in the middle of the woods. I rub my eyes and smack Donnie for a second. It's about the time he is eyeing me with anger and seems to be questioning my reasoning for smacking him, that I ask him if he's seeing what I'm seeing. Donnie looks ahead and nods before saying, "Naked babes in the woods. Yeah, I'm seeing it." I remember letting out a huge burst of laughter and watching as they stopped singing and dancing and looked over at us. Figuring we are caught and just being super horny, I step out with my arms raised and say, "I'm lost." It's funny, because later Donnie would tell me how he thought it was weird, that I didn't run or anything, and that I had just had this shamelessly happy sound in my voice as I approached them. Donnie, and of course, followed me soon after, realizing we were caught either way. We spent a great amount of time after that talking and singing and dancing in the woods with these beautiful women. The last thing I remember before passing out was laying on the ground with one of the women who kissed me. Then everything after that was a blur. When we woke hours later, we were naked and there was no one around. There was a dead campfire where I remember the woman had been dancing, but part of me thought I probably imagined most of that. At least, I thought that, until I put my clothes back on and found something in my pocket. It was a necklace with a heart-shaped stone on it. It has a sharp point where the heart tips at the bottom. I didn't own anything like this, and it's the only thing that has led me to question if that crazy night in the woods was real after all. We spent another day collecting ourselves and finding our way out of the woods. When we finally found a way out, we hit a highway and eventually asked someone for a ride back to the campgrounds themselves. We spent a couple of days out in the wilderness, and I felt a profound closeness to nature ever since that camping trip. I know my story isn't scary and was pretty funny more than anything, and I realize we were tripping hard on weed and drugs, but I can't help but be thankful for that couple of days. I'm not entirely sure if everything was the weed or not, but it has altered my life since. I wound up moving out to a more rural area, and I've been camping many times since. I'm still good friends with Donnie, and I'm grateful that although we got high and lost in the woods, it all turned out to be for the better ultimately. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend wandering into the woods high, but in my case, it brought me closer to nature and completely changed my life as a result. Last year, I had a very strange experience in a national forest out in California. I was by myself on a road trip with my dog, and I was driving pretty far into the Mendocino National Forest. I like to camp in national parks and forests because it's isolated, so my dog can roam and they're free of charge. A trade-off for sketchy rough drives into parks sometimes and a lack of service and assistance. Anyway, I was driving up this dirt road kind of curling up a mountain around maybe 5 p.m. It was very nice out, sunny and warm with a slight breeze. Nothing serious happened, but I felt extremely uncomfortable driving into the area. That feeling did not let up. Driving up the mountain, I felt like I shouldn't stay there, and I texted my boyfriend that it just didn't feel right in this area. But my phone completely lost service very quickly. I was looking for a sign of another person having been around the area lately, but didn't see anything. I pulled over and got out of my car with my dog to look over the edge and noticed a dead squirrel on some broken glass mixed in with dirt on the gravel road. Yucca, my dog, starts to growl slightly. She's vocal, but I've almost never seen her growl at anything other than dogs. I did see her growl at a possum once, so it could be something she smelled maybe. This place continued to make me feel quite on edge, but I pride myself on being an independent traveler and backpacker, so I decided to continue at least a little bit further with my grumbling pup to see if I could find a good place to camp. I continued to notice more dead animals. Keep in mind, no one is going to be going more than 5 to 10 miles per hour up this road anyway, and that's if anyone's even there. I hear men's voices. They sound close, and I think I should call out to them. So I stop my car and then kind of freeze. I feel like I shouldn't. I can't really make out what they're saying. I don't see any sign of people anywhere. Can I get back in my car and continue to slowly drive forward and cautiously look for what the voices could be coming from? I've never run into people in a national park or forest when I've gone this deep in. The unsettling feeling grows about the voices, which have sort of come and gone a few times, and scared and focused on getting out of there. I just distinctly remember being surprised at hearing grumbling when we started outside of my car. Kind of dangerously quickly, I went back down the mountain, not seeing any sign of anyone. I decided to spring for luxury and get a hotel for the night. I figured I was just fine, and a huge open spaces can be intimidating, I told myself. The voices could have been echoing from somewhere far off, and they just sounded close. Animals died, glass gets broken, nothing happened, cool. But I remember this place. It sticks with me. Whenever I'm watching scary movies, if I'm walking my dog in the woods at night, nothing compares to that feeling I had driving up that mountain, and it's honestly kind of interesting to me, as well as frightening. I recently happened across some information as well as some Native American lore that made me feel extremely uneasy. Fast forward a year. I've mentioned this place to a few people, and the haunting vibes that it gave, and nothing much more. I googled the national park once and didn't see anything, but didn't look much either. I like scary movies and things of that nature, hence my fascination with this little event. So my boyfriend and I were coming out fishing from our trip just yesterday. We were in Wyoming for a wedding. There were only 2-3 hours left and the sun had set, so we decided to listen to some scary podcasts and YouTube videos. We went from the No Sleep podcast to the X-Files, and ended up on some True Stories video dealing with the Native American lore. I'm half paying attention, petting my dog and playing some Pokemon on an emulator, and I hear the narrator mention Wendigos. Very briefly, he says that they are casually known to mimic voices. I mean, when I say that, I got horrible chills. I got horrible chills. I stare at my boyfriend and ask him if he remembers that national forest I was freaked out about last year. He says he does, and he reminds me that he texted me when I was probably close to a Wendigo. I remember him saying that, but didn't know much about their lore and thought he was just being funny, like, yeah, Bigfoot is probably stalking you, or some other dad joke. And he was like, no. I mean, I was mostly joking, but I said specifically because you said you were hearing voices that you couldn't find a trace of. I feel strange as how, and I start Googling Wendigos, etc. They are allegedly able to mimic human voices, and they will live in that sort of area. It all matched up. Obviously, there's a ton of questionable info out there, and I tried to find more reputable websites and authentic experiences. I've done a lot of solo traveling both in and out of the country, and I've never had such a bad feeling before. On top of seeing an unnecessary amount of dead animals in a national forest, which just seems strange, I don't think I'll be doing any more solo travels around there, unless it's around civilization, of course. Does anyone know of any authentic Native American lore, Or has anyone else had any kind of inexplicable experience like this?
I've been living in Louisiana my entire life. For the purposes of my safety, I'll only state the state I live in. I like to go camping quite a bit, and when I do, I usually bring my friends with me. I'm a 33-year-old female, but my story takes place when I was just 22. I was off for the summer from college and I decided I wanted to go camping. As I said before, I usually take my friends with me, but this summer, they all had plans and most of them were going out of state to see friends, family, and loved ones. I'm the type of person who really loves a good adventure, and while my friends being unable to go with me was a bit of a bummer, I wasn't about it to let me hold back from camping. So in June, I decided I'd go camping. I wanted somewhere somewhat new to me, and I wanted to wander off the beaten path. I know this can be dangerous, but at the time, my thought was, what's the sense of going on an adventure if I can't do a little exploring? It wasn't the first time I'd done something like this, but the key difference this time was, I didn't have any friends with me. This was the first and last time I'd ever make that mistake. I went to a fairly popular camping ground a few towns away from where I live. I was geared up and excited for whatever adventures may come my way. For the first while, I explored around potential camping spots, and when I got the chance, I snuck off into the woods. The thing about this campsite is, like any site, there are areas that they recommend you to camp in, or in some cases, tell you to camp. These are usually the areas a lot of tourists or first-time campers might stay. Then, there are the areas you are recommended to stay out of or told straight up not to camp in. I ignored the warning signs and went off the trail with my gear in tow. I had food and plenty of water and thought I'd be fine while out there. I told my family I'd be camping over the weekend, but I never actually told them where I'd be. I know, this was stupid. The thrill seeker I didn't think much of it at the time. To me, it was just another way for the trip to be more exciting. I wandered for hours. Upon first leaving the beaten path, it was about 1:30 in the afternoon. When I finally decided to set up camp for the night, in a clearing I had found, it was around 7:30 in the evening. I set up camp, ate, and chilled a while. The only sounds accompanying me were the sounds of birds and other animals and the slight breeze blowing through the trees. I felt so relaxed even though I was aware I didn't know where I was. I didn't think this as a problem at the time, as I'd been marking trees along my walk, so I knew how to get back if need be. Anyways, as night was drawing closer, I decided to set up my tent, and once dark came, I headed into my tent for the night. At least, that was the plan. I figured I'd get up early and maybe explore for another day, staying one more night before heading back. I'd mark my way as I did and figured I'd have no problems getting home after that. Sadly, this wasn't how things would go at all. I crashed pretty quickly and was sleeping soundly until I heard something or someone approaching. It was the sound of snapping twigs, and then the sound of talking that initially woke me up. This didn't initially bother me, as I thought maybe someone had seen my markers and wandered out there themselves to explore. I carried a big knife on me at all times as well, and was fully prepared to use it if need be. The thing that first bothered me was the fact that I heard two men. It wasn't that they were men that bothered me, it was that some of what I was hearing coming from them. There was a discussion about the pieces of rope on the trees. This led them to talking about how someone might be out there. My first thought was, I'm an idiot. This could be game and fish wardens, or some form of law enforcement, who followed my markers right to me, and I was potentially going to be fined for being out here where I shouldn't be and ignoring all the signs with warnings. Looking back on it, I wish it had been some form of law enforcement or animal protection. The conversation took a dark turn quite quickly as one of these men laughed and talked about how they shouldn't worry about anyone coming out this way, as he'd been cutting the rope off the trees as they followed it. It was at this point I thought I am definitely an idiot, as these clearly aren't law enforcement officers, and the way they were laughing and talking made it sounded like they weren't coming with good intentions. Also, without my markers, I'm gonna be completely lost. Being lost was something I still believed I could probably handle, but approaching my campsite wasn't something I was sure of. I was too afraid to move and leave my tent, as I could hear them getting close enough to that any movement would have given me away. It wasn't long before I heard them just outside my tent. They were laughing and talking to one another about my tent. They kept asking each other if they thought someone was sleeping in the tent. I heard one of them say, "I hope so." They drew a gun. I couldn't see these guys very well, but I was terrified at this moment. I sat there frozen, waiting to see what they did next and praying that they didn't try anything. I remember thinking I was dumb to think this was a good idea. I pulled out my knife and gripped it slowly as one of the men slowly approached my tent. He began unzipping it, and as he did, both men laughed at one another. The second he finished unzipping the tent, I jumped forward and stuck my knife into the man unzipping the tent. He screamed, and I sprinted away as fast as I could, looking back as I heard one of their guns go off. I remember hearing one of them call me something vile as the other man began to give chase. I think I surprised them, as having stabbed one of them, he let me free in the moment, so the only way that I got out was because of that. I remember hearing the man screaming about how when he found me, he was going to change my attitude. He also mentioned how he and his buddy would teach me some manners. This obviously terrified me as I ran, as I had a fair idea of what they probably meant by that. I usually keep my ID and anything like that on me, so I felt relief in the fact that I had these things on me as I ran. I couldn't help but continue running, and I tried to fight thoughts in my mind that told me I could wind up never being seen again if I so much as slowed down. The most horrific part of this was thinking that I'd never see my friends and family again, and that if these two guys caught me, who knows what state my body would be found in, if I was ever found at all. The horrific potentials that ran through my mind, coupled with the adrenaline running through me, were enough to keep me sprinting for far longer than I would have been able to. Eventually, however, I needed to stop and breathe. It was dark and I was lost. I no longer had my markers to guide me, and in these woods, everything looked the same. I listened closely for sounds of the two men, but I heard nothing. I began to think I may have outrun them, and that brought me some solace. They likely knew I hadn't gotten a real look at neither of them, so I hoped that they would just give up and go away. That was a great thought, but I wasn't entirely sure if that was the case, and now I was out in the middle of the woods, lost, with no food or water to speak of. I walked for much of the night, and eventually I found an area where I tried to drag some brush and kind of block myself from sight in a makeshift shelter. I walked for much of the night, and eventually I found an area where I tried to drag some brush and kind of block myself from sight in a makeshift shelter. I hoped if the two men happened around the area, they wouldn't find me. I was too tired and exhausted at this point, and I crashed. I woke up the next morning to the sound of footsteps. I freaked out and was too scared to move. My first thought was the two guys had caught up with me, and I was probably going to die after something horrible was done to me. As it turns out, though, it was law enforcement. I had peeked out only to see someone in a game and fish outfit looking at me. I guess I had wandered much closer to the main camping area than I had realized. I consider this extremely lucky, and I thank God every day that I was able to find a way, however haphazardly, back to the main campground. The guy approached me and told me he had heard someone wandering around the area while patrolling and decided to check it out. He talked to me for a bit about not wandering off the main campgrounds, and then he asked me what was going on. I explained everything to him, and he called law enforcement. I talked to them, and they did a search of the woods. They found my campsite, but they never found the men who tried assaulting me. I told them I stabbed one of them, and he probably still had my knife. I'm guessing they covered their tracks pretty thoroughly after that. I'm not sure if they ever got the men, but I'm sharing my story to say you should never go camping alone unless you are fully prepared in every possible way. Even then, you should be aware of where you are going, where you are, and also let someone know where you'll be. I'm grateful I survived my encounter, and have never gone camping alone since. I learn from my mistakes and I only go camping now with my friends, and usually we keep to areas where we can easily be found. Whoever those two men were, I hope they are caught. You should always be wary of your surroundings, and you should always be safe while camping.
Behind the local college in my area, there are some beautiful woods. A deep rushing creek runs through it. It has a little bit of a valley, and it's a literally paradise. There is a magical quality there, and even a little tree spirit that I always visit and leave a little tribute to. My bestie and I are avid harvesters, and the woods behind the college literally have everything. I've even found berry patches that aren't usually in the area, and all the local herbs and medicinal plants that you need. It's really amazing. Several years ago, we were cranberry picking in the fall. Now I'm not really good at keeping my bearings, so I basically just went wandering through the woods with my nose in the berry patches and enjoying spending the time with my friend. Sometimes we were on the trail, and sometimes we would break trail through the brush and forest to forage and wander. It's a small slice of woods in between two major roadways, with the college and residential areas at opposite ends, so the chances of getting lost are impossible, unless you are a total dunce. So I wasn't worried about getting lost where we were. We rounded up a hill, and there was a sort of clearing at the crest, with nothing but a tree sitting in the middle of it right by the path. Now, it is a spruce tree, and spruce trees can either grow straight, or if there are upheavals in the soil, they can curve in weird ways. This tree was curved into a reversed S shape, but instead of it looking like a natural growth, it looked like the tree had been twisted violently into an unnatural shape. I really can't describe it better than that. I grew up in spruce forest, and I've never seen a tree that I thought looked like it had been purposely warped like that. As I walked up the path towards the tree, I suddenly heard a ringing in my ears that intensified with every step taken closer to the tree. And when I was less than 10 feet away from it, I got a sharp pain above my right eyebrow that felt like a red-hot needle stabbing me. It was overwhelming, but as I walked away from the tree, the pain and ringing subsided. Being the type of person I am, I got really curious and started walking back towards the tree, and the ringing starts getting louder, and the pain happens in my head. Okay, so despite my experiences with the paranormal, I am a natural-born skeptic. So I called out my friend, asked her to come over and tell me if she noticed anything. She also said she got the ringing and pain. It was really weird. We talked about it at a safe distance for a bit and decided to leave the area as we were getting a really bad feeling about the tree. That night, we both had really awful nightmares that we were lost in the woods, being blood-soaked in some sort of battlefield, and being chased by zombies. It all sounded really weird, but it was all really freaky. This year, we talked about it again. We both vividly remember that tree. We've also never wandered into that particular corner of the woods again. What we both agree on is that there's a malevolent energy contained in that tree, and something really horrible must have happened there. I have a friend who practices magic, and I may take him out there to try to cleanse the energy, but I honestly am a bit afraid to be in that corner of the woods ever again.